In this video, I want to talk to you about the nature of experiential knowing. Let's just back up a bit. Since we started thinking about participatory research, one of the questions that we've been wondering about and thinking through is what's the nature of validity in participative research of various sorts? And of course, we decided the word validity comes from positivist research, so we started talking about quality. What's quality research? And if you think about it, the whole basis of science is based on the dualism of subject and object. This goes back to Descartes and other people, and the idea is dividing the thinking subject from the unthinking object, the res cogitans from the res extensa, the consciousness is all on one side. And as soon as you say, well, people can be researchers of their own situation, experiential researchers, participative researchers, you've broken away that. You've undercut the whole of Western science, which is fun. So what do we mean by research? What do we mean by quality? And the first piece I want to get you is from the first book we did, Human Inquiry, back in 1981, a quote from the great Carl Rogers: "Scientific methodology needs to be seen for what it truly is, a way of preventing me from deceiving myself in regard to my creatively formed subjective hunches, which have developed out of the relationship between me and my material." A way of preventing me from deceiving myself about my creatively formed subjective hunches. I think that's a really good way of thinking about research. Come back to that business of deceiving ourselves. Now, the second thing I wanted to read from this early chapter this was the first chapter we did on validity, is from Gregory Bateson, the great systems thinker, who anybody who knows, has been in touch with me, knows that I'm a great Bateson fan. And he says that in modern research, it's a question of getting away from the universality of objectivity. So he writes, "The word objective becomes, of course, quite quietly obsolete. And at the same time, the word subjective, which normally confines you within your skin, disappears as well." So he's interested in systemic thinking where the flows of information are not held within the skin-encapsulated ego, if you like. "It is, I think, the debunking of the objective that's the important change. The world is no longer out there in quite the way it used to seem to be." And then he talks about what happens if you prick your finger with a pin. It's real, and yet it's also an experience that you have. There's a combining or a marriage between an objectivity that is passive to the outside world and a creative subjectivity. It's neither pure solipsism nor its opposite. And consider for a moment the phrase, the opposite of solipsism. In solipsism, you're ultimately alone, isolated and alone, isolated by the premise, I make it all up. But at the other extreme, the opposite of solipsism, you would cease to exist, becoming nothing but a metaphoric feather blown by the winds of external reality. Somewhere between these two is a region where you're partly blown by the winds of reality and partly an artist creating a composite out of inner and outer events. So playing around in this place between the subjective and the object, both of which of course have disappeared according to Bateson, is what we're trying to do here. So there are two threats to validity in, how do I get this up? There are two threats to validity in participative research. One is that we get stuck in that solipsistic side that Bateson talks about and project our own wish fulfillment, our own internal ideas, or in Rogers' terms, we just project our creative hunches out onto the world and assume they're right. And then we can get together and collude as a community to support and confirm those biases. So one is a personal projection, if you like, of wish fulfillment or something like that. And the second is that we do that communally. Now, just as a quick aside, there's an interesting piece of work by Georges Devereux, who was a psychoanalyst and interested in anthropology. And his argument is that the very process of research creates anxiety. And that anxiety about not understanding what there is in the world, or not understanding whether we have a right to make up the world, leads to us projecting our anxieties out into the world. He sees that as similar to the psychoanalytic process of transference. And he argues that some of the early anthropologists, he quotes Malinowski, for example, spent an awful lot of his time in his own tent writing supposed anthropological records because he was so anxious about getting out there amongst the native people. And so he kept himself to himself. So the way we talked about this place between solipsism and its opposite is with the idea of critical subjectivity, or we sometimes called it a rigor of softness. Now the idea here is that if you think in developmental terms, we start as a child blown about by our emotions. Let me find the reference. This is in Human Inquiry in Action. Starts from naive inquiry based on our primitive subjective experiences of the world as a child, very prone to distortions arising from our own biases and anxieties, but of course is also clean in some ways and very direct. So there's both there in the child. But it's unreliable in the naive inquiry. But it's unreliable. A lot of good qualities because it's alive, involved, committed, important part of our humanity. And we lose a lot if we try to throw it out altogether. But that's what the adult, the objective thinking, rational adult in modern society, modern Western society does. So we move to objective consciousness. And we have to be taught to do that. We have to be taught to see the world in objective terms. That's what the socialization of becoming a scientist, for example, is all about. You don't look at a slide through a microscope and see the world. You have to be taught what it is to see. You have to be taught to see objectively. This was what Henryk Skolimowski argued in his book, The Subjective Side of, not the Subjective Side of Science, The Participatory Mind. So, critical subjectivity is a quality of awareness in which we do not suppress our primary subjective experience, nor do we allow ourselves to be overwhelmed and swept along by it. Rather, we raise it to consciousness and use it as part of the inquiry process. So, rather than flipping off from a naive inquiry to an objective inquiry, we draw those together. We notice what we see. We notice our responses to it. We may then try to bracket them and look again. One of my graduate students, Angela Brew, wrote a really nice PhD, and part of what she said was, it was about the nature of science. If you think you know, then look again. And she thought that was the basis of all good research. Now this then, and particularly, let me just say, particularly paying attention to the biases that distort. So there's a whole history of seeing the world as an objective thing out there, and that's a projection from a particular form of consciousness. Just in the same way as a lot of men decided they would study women's sexuality and projected their understanding of that. Freud, for example, they projected their understanding onto the data without any sense of awareness of doing that. Now this takes us on to Husserl, the philosopher Husserl, and the idea of phenomenology. And Husserl really made a big break from the tradition of European philosophy, which was concerned about what's the nature of the real and what is real and those kinds of questions. And he said what we need to really get into, because we'll never resolve those, is to notice what the world is like as it appears to us. It's about describing phenomena. The phenomenologist's job is to describe, stripping away distractions, habits, cliches of thought, presumptions and received ideas in order to return our attention to what Husserl called, the things in themselves. We must fix our beady gaze on them and capture them exactly as they appear rather than as we think they're supposed to be. How does a thing present itself to your experience? And Husserl had this idea of bracketing, or what he called the epoche, which was to gather, to record experience and then interrogate it very carefully to see what kind of biases had been projected into that, and then to bracket them and then to come and have another look. So continually looking and looking again. And this is very fundamental to the whole process. So experiential inquiry, again, both has that quality of being naive and essential and there, but also reflected on, considered, interrogated. And both those aspects of it are really important. Just to see what my notes say then. So let me now turn to where John Heron and I wrote about experiential inquiry. And I'm going to read this because I think it's quite well written. We start from the position that all knowing is based on the experiential presence of persons in the world. Any form of inquiry that fails to honour this presence through premature abstraction, conceptualization, measurement, political bias, ignores the fundamental grounding of all knowing. Experiential knowing is my direct acquaintance with which I meet my life world. It's essentially tacit and pre-verbal. As soon as we start putting words on it, we move away from that immediacy of experience. So holding that immediacy is really, really, really significant. So we quote Jeff Mead, my dear colleague, who was just working in the police force. He was a senior policeman when I knew him in England. And he wrote in his PhD, an integral part of my being in the world, my living inquiry, is firmly anchored in the bedrock of my experience. I have actively sought new experiences and pushed my boundaries considerably in doing so, whether it be in ritual men's work, separation and divorce, storytelling performances, creating and delivering large-scale education programs for the police and others. Without such experiential grounding, I believe that action research remains as speculative and theoretical as its reductionist cousins. So this encounter is prior to language and art, although it can be symbolized in language and art. Our meeting of the elemental properties of the living world, that I-thou encounter, that's Buber's notion of I-thou, which of course resonates very much with a panpsychic kind of thing, the notion that the world is thou. And only by meeting the world as thou, as subject, as person, do we retain our own personhood. Our meeting with the elemental properties of the living world cannot be confused with our symbolic constructs. If you find yourself doubting this, try the simple exercise of opening yourself to the presence of another, and that other could be in the more than human world, and compare that with thinking about her or him. So there's a lot of ideas there that all come together. And so what I'm really interested in inviting you to do is to think of experiential knowing and to think of your encounters with the more than human world, with the beings that you're addressing, that you're working with, that you're communicating with. Think of what happens as that in itself. Try not to rush into saying, oh, that's a communication, or that's this, or that's that. Try not to resort very quickly to your preconceptions. That can come later. There is a place for making sense. We have a very simple question. If we address the world as a person, as a subjective presence, does it respond to us? And what is the quality of that response? And that demands, first of all, attention and noticing and recording and reflecting and noticing and reflecting again. Now, one thing we can do to help each other is to notice when other people, when our colleagues rush into premature speculation, when they rush into making sense too quickly. And that's what you can do in your little groups. You can say, hold on, you had this encounter and you're putting this meaning onto it straight away. Are you doing that too quickly? You had this dream and you've interpreted it this way. You now think you know what it means, or you've pinned it down. Well, in pinning it down, the question always is, what have you lost? So I hope that makes sense. I'm very happy to respond to any comments or questions that you may have about this video.